Beneath the wooden sidewalks of Old Sacramento, if you pay $20 and follow a guide through a steel door, you will find yourself standing in a room that used to be a first-floor storefront and is now 12 feet underground. The ceiling above you is the street. The walls still have their original brick. There are doorways that open into packed earth because the building next door didn't survive. This is not an archaeological dig. This is not ancient ruins. This is a city that in the 1860s and 1870s decided to bury itself alive, to jack up its own buildings, fill in its own streets with dirt hauled in by the wagon load, and build a new ground level on top of the old one. Not a single block, not a neighborhood, the entire downtown. And the reason they did it, the reason any of this exists at all, is one of the most absurd sequences of survival, stubbornness, and sheer financial audacity in American history. Sacramento should not be here. That is not a figure of speech. The ground on which the city was founded sits at the confluence of two rivers, on a floodplain so low and so flat that the Nisenan people who lived in the valley for thousands of years before white settlement never built permanent structures there. They knew what happened when the rains came. The valley became an inland sea. They moved to higher ground and waited. The man who ignored this was a Swiss bankrupt named Johann August Sutter. He'd later Americanize it to John Sutter, who arrived in Mexican California in 1839, fleeing debts and a family he'd abandoned in Europe. Mexico gave him a land grant of roughly 50,000 acres, and he built a trading post he called New Helvetia, New Switzerland, on the banks of the American River. He ran cattle, he grew wheat. He employed local indigenous people and built a fort with adobe walls 12 feet high. By the mid-1840s, Sutter was operating what amounted to a feudal estate in the wilderness, a flour mill, a blanket factory, a distillery. He was, for a few years, one of the most powerful men in California. Then, on the morning of January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall looked down into the tail race of a sawmill he was building for Sutter on the American River, near a place called Coloma, about 40 miles upstream. He saw something glinting in the clear water. He picked it up. It was a gold nugget roughly the size of a dime. And that single piece of metal destroyed John Sutter's life, created the state of California, and pulled 300,000 people across oceans and continents to the Sacramento Valley within 2 years, the largest peacetime migration in American history to that date. It also brought into existence a city that would spend the next 2 decades trying not to drown, burn, or die of cholera, and would respond to each catastrophe by doubling down so hard that it became the starting point of the most ambitious engineering project on the continent. Sutter tried to keep the discovery quiet. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that gold would be the end of him. He was right. Within weeks, his workers deserted their posts. Within months, squatters overran his land, slaughtered his cattle, trampled his wheat. His stores were looted, his fields were stripped. By 1852, the man on whose property the California gold rush began was bankrupt. He would spend the last 28 years of his life trying to get compensation from either the state of California or the federal government. In 1880, he had a bill before Congress that would have given him $50,000 for everything he'd lost. Congress adjourned on June 16th without voting on it. 2 days later, John Sutter died in a Washington hotel room. He was 77 years old. But before Sutter's ruin was complete, his son, John Sutter, Jr., saw what was coming and did the thing his father never could. He thought commercially. The younger Sutter hired a surveyor and laid out a grid for a new city at his father's old river landing, the Embarcadero, where steamboats arrived from San Francisco. He named it Sacramento after the river, and he began selling lots. Among his partners in this venture was a man named Sam Brannan, and Sam Brannan is the reason we should all pay closer attention to who's selling the shovels. Brannan was a Mormon elder from Maine who'd arrived in San Francisco in 1846. He published the city's first newspaper and opened a general store near Sutter's Fort. In early 1848, when miners started paying for their goods with gold dust, Brannan didn't pick up a pan. He picked up the business opportunity. He quietly bought every pickaxe, shovel, and tin pan he could find between San Francisco and the foothills. Then he walked down to the San Francisco waterfront, held a bottle of gold flakes over his head, and shouted the words that set the whole thing in motion. Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River! Within 9 weeks, Brannan had made $36,000 selling supplies. Within a few years, he was California's first millionaire. By 1856, he reportedly owned 1/5 of all the real estate in San Francisco and a comparable share of Sacramento. He was earning between $250,000 and $500,000 a year in 1850s money. The gold rush made plenty of men rich. Almost none of them were miners. They were men like Brannan, merchants, speculators, storekeepers. The fortune wasn't in the ground. It was in the men standing over the ground, selling them something to dig with. By 1850, Sacramento had roughly 8,000 residents and a feverish economy built entirely on the act of passing through. It was the supply hub for the entire mother lode, the string of mining camps running through the Sierra Nevada foothills, where over 130,000 miners were digging, panning, and blasting for gold. Steamboats arrived daily from San Francisco, loaded with goods and passengers. J Street and K Street were lined with canvas-walled stores, wooden hotels, gambling halls, and saloons that never closed. A shovel that cost a few cents in the East sold for $15 in Sacramento. Eggs went for $1 apiece. A lot on the waterfront that sold for $200 in January could resell for $10,000 by June. The entire city was a transaction. Everything bought, sold, marked up, turned over. Sacramento was incorporated as a city in 1849, the first city in California to receive that distinction. It had a charter, a mayor, a council. What it did not have was any infrastructure capable of withstanding the landscape it had been built on. The city jail was a ship anchored on the riverbank. In January 1850, the rivers rose. Floodwaters tore through town, washing away tents, shacks, and merchandise. One observer described houses, boxes, barrels, horses, mules, and cattle sweeping by with the swollen torrent. The water climbed 9 feet in 24 hours at 7th and P Streets. The new mayor, Hardin Bigelow, a contractor who'd helped build the city's first levees, organized a heroic defense, and his efforts prevented the worst of a second flood surge in March. He was rewarded 7 months later by being shot. On August 14, 1850, a group of squatters, men who'd seized land they claimed was public and refused to leave, formed an armed column at the corner of 4th and J Streets and opened fire on a posse led by Mayor Bigelow and the city sheriff. 5 men were killed, including 2 bystanders. Bigelow took 4 bullets. The sheriff was mortally wounded. Martial law was declared. The squatters were eventually dispersed, but the violence had barely subsided when something worse arrived. In October 1850, a steamboat called the New World docked in Sacramento. The ship carried 2 things: the official news that California had been admitted to the Union as the 31st state, and the cholera bacterium. The irony was exquisite. Statehood and plague arriving on the same vessel. In a city with no sewers, no clean water supply, streets that doubled as open cesspools, and 8,000 people crammed along a muddy riverbank, cholera moved with appalling speed. The first death was recorded on October 20th. Within 3 weeks, 1,000 people were dead and another 1,000 were sick. 80% of the population fled. 17 of the city's physicians died. A man walking down J Street one evening simply dropped and was dead before anyone could carry him through the nearest door. The mayor, who had survived 4 gunshot wounds in August, contracted cholera in November and died in San Francisco. Flood, riot, plague, all in the same calendar year in a city that was barely 2 years old. Most settlements would have been abandoned. Sacramento's population actually grew. And then on the night of November 2nd, 1852, it burned. The fire started in a millinery shop, Madame Lanos's hat store on J Street between 3rd and 4th, around 11 o'clock at night. The city was still built largely of wood and canvas. The flames spread with a speed that left no time for organized firefighting. By morning, more than 80% of the structures in Sacramento were gone. 2,500 buildings. The damage was estimated at $6 million, more than $200 million in today's money. It was called the Great Conflagration, and it should have been the end. Within 1 month, 761 new buildings had been erected. This time, many of them were brick. Many had iron shutters on the windows, designed to keep fire from spreading between buildings. The city did not pause. It did not reflect. It rebuilt faster and harder, and it rebuilt with better materials. Sacramento's survival was not inevitable. It had rivals. Sutterville, a few miles downriver on higher ground, had been founded by John Sutter Sr. as a competitor. Other settlements, Fremont, Washington, a scattering of camps along the rivers, had vied for the same trade. All of them are gone now or absorbed. Sacramento outlasted them not because of advantages in geography or resources, but because each time the city was knocked down, enough people decided to stay and rebuild rather than relocate. That decision, made individually by thousands of shopkeepers and speculators and laborers, compounded over the years into something that began to look like permanence. Sacramento was learning something about itself, something that would matter enormously in a few years, when the test became not fire or flood or disease, but an act of engineering so improbable that the man who proposed it was given a nickname as his professional title. They called him Crazy Judah. Theodore DeHone Judah was a civil engineer from Connecticut who arrived in Sacramento in 1854 at the age of 28, already recognized as one of the finest railroad engineers in the country. He had been hired to survey and build the Sacramento Valley Railroad, a 22-mile line from Sacramento to Folsom, a route designed to carry supplies to the gold miners in the foothills. The line opened on February 22, 1856, with a locomotive named the Sacramento pulling a string of passenger cars and flatbeds out along R Street while a crowd cheered. A second locomotive, the Nevada, broke down before reaching Folsom, but the politicians and citizens from both trains eventually arrived at the Meredith Hotel, where they celebrated with a railroad ball that lasted until 5 in the morning. It was the first railroad west of the Mississippi River. For most men, that would have been enough. For Judah, it was a down payment. He wanted to build a railroad across the entire continent. He wanted to take a line from Sacramento over the Sierra Nevada, mountains that rose to more than 7,000 feet, cut with granite canyons and buried in snow for months at a time, across the Nevada desert, across the Rockies, and connect it to the rail network in the east. People listened politely. Then they walked away. His own wife would later recall that it was the burden of his thought, day and night, largely of his conversation, till it used to be said Judah's Pacific Railroad crazy. But Judah was not crazy. He was meticulous. In 1860, he surveyed a viable route over the Sierra Nevada through Donner Pass, the same pass where the Donner Party had met its terrible end 14 years earlier. He mapped every grade, every curve, every tunnel that would need to be blasted through solid granite. He took his plans to San Francisco's bankers and merchants, the men with real money. They turned him down flat. The route was too difficult, the cost too high, the risk too great. San Francisco didn't need Sacramento's railroad. San Francisco had the port. So, in June of 1861, Judah walked into the shops of 4 Sacramento merchants and made his pitch. The men were not financiers. They were not engineers. They were shopkeepers. Collis Huntington sold hardware with his partner Mark Hopkins at a store on K Street. Leland Stanford ran a grocery store. Charles Crocker sold dry goods. They had come to California during the gold rush, not to mine, but to sell things to miners. The same instinct that had made Sam Brannan rich a decade earlier. Judah asked each of them for $15,000. Their combined investment came to about $100,000. It barely covered the down payment on the surveys. On June 28, 1861, they incorporated the Central Pacific Railroad Company of California. Stanford was named president. Huntington became vice president. Hopkins was treasurer. Crocker took charge of construction. Judah was chief engineer. The offices were on the second floor of the Huntington and Hopkins hardware store, above the bins of nails and shovels. The most important railroad company in American history was born in a room that smelled like iron filings. Meanwhile, Sacramento was also building a state capitol. Construction had begun in 1860 on a 4-square-block site purchased with county tax money. The architect, Reuben Clark, estimated the building could be completed for $500,000. Then the floods came. The winter of 1861 to 1862 brought what is still considered the worst natural disaster in California's recorded history. Beginning in November 1861, storms hammered the Pacific coast for weeks. Sacramento recorded 37 inches of rain in 2 months. Warm rains fell on the Sierra snowpack, sending walls of meltwater into the valley. The Sacramento River swelled more than 20 feet above its normal level. The levees, those levees that Mayor Bigelow had built with his own hands in 1850, were no match. On January 9, 1862, the water came over the top. Within days, Sacramento was submerged. The Central Valley became an inland lake 300 miles long and 20 miles wide, deep enough in places to cover telegraph poles that had just been installed. Newly elected Governor Leland Stanford, the grocery merchant, the railroad president, had to take a rowboat to his own inauguration on January 10th. When he rode back to his mansion on N Street, a house he'd purchased for $8,000 the year before, he found the floodwaters reaching the parlor windows. Some of his furniture was floating. He reportedly climbed in through a second-story window. The state government packed up and moved to San Francisco for 6 months. The damage across California was estimated at $100 million in 1862 currency, roughly $3 billion today. The flood effectively bankrupted the state. And here is where Sacramento did the thing that no other city in America has ever done at this scale. They didn't leave. They didn't rebuild on higher ground. They raised the ground. The decision was made by city leaders and property owners in the aftermath of the flood. Sacramento would be elevated. The entire downtown street grid would be lifted 10 to 15 feet above its existing level. Buildings would be jacked up on screw jacks, placed every 8 feet around the perimeter, cranked by teams of laborers, until the structures sat at the new grade. Then the space beneath the streets would be filled in, one wagon load of dirt at a time, hauled from the riverbanks by horse-drawn carts. Thousands of cubic yards of earth, dumped and graded, month after month, year after year. The project took 20 years. Some property owners raised their buildings. Others couldn't afford to and simply let the new street level rise around them. Their first floors became basements. Their front doors opened onto walls of earth. Merchants who couldn't afford to raise their buildings kept operating at the old level, with customers climbing down makeshift ladders to reach their shops. In some cases, the sidewalks between a raised building and an unraised one were at different heights, connected by steps or ramps or nothing at all. You could walk along a block of J Street and find yourself 10 feet higher at one end than the other. The result for years was a city at 2 levels, the old Sacramento and the new Sacramento existing simultaneously, one on top of the other. Hollow sidewalks bridged the gaps, creating a network of voids and passages between the 2 grades. Some of those passages were used as storage. Some became the domain of rats. Some were simply sealed and forgotten. Stanford raised his own mansion by 12 feet, added an entire new floor below it and a mansard-roofed floor above it, and expanded it from 4,000 to 19,000 square feet. It became for a time one of the most magnificent houses in California. 44 rooms, among the first 3 homes in Sacramento with indoor running water. The man who had rode to his inauguration now lived in something approaching a palace, elevated above the valley floor by the same act of collective stubbornness that was reshaping the entire city. The Capitol was being raised, too. Construction crews hauled wheelbarrows of dirt to elevate the building site by 15 feet. Architect Reuben Clark, already struggling with piecemeal funding — the legislature met only 2 months every 2 years, so work would proceed until the money ran out and then halt — cracked under the strain. In 1866, a crack appeared in the center of the Capitol's basement wall. The resulting investigation and public outcry contributed to Clark's collapse. He was committed to the Stockton Mental Institution, where he died. The official diagnosis: insanity caused by continued and close attention to the building of the state capitol in Sacramento. Gordon Cummings took over as supervising architect and finished the job in 1874. The final cost was $2,450,000. The dome rises 210 feet and is topped with a gold-plated copper ball, a nod to the industry that built the city and destroyed the man who owned the land it sits on. But the Capitol was not the most consequential thing Sacramento was building in 1863. On January 8th of that year, only days after the last floodwaters had receded, Governor Stanford stood at the corner of Front and K Streets in mud on straw that had been spread over the muck, and pushed a silver shovel into a pile of pre-dried dirt. It had rained that morning, but cleared by noon. Stanford told the small crowd that the day is not far distant when the Pacific will be bound to the Atlantic by iron bands. He was breaking ground on the Central Pacific Railroad, the most ambitious construction project in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Was launching from a city that had been underwater a few weeks earlier. The first rails weren't actually spiked until October 26th of that year. By then, Theodore Judah was gone. The relationship between Judah and the Big Four had soured badly. The associates, as they preferred to be called, were more interested in monopolizing freight traffic in and out of Sacramento than in the visionary project Judah had conceived. Judah, disgusted, sold his interest for $100,000 and sailed for New York in October 1863, planning to raise capital from Eastern investors to buy the Big Four out and finish the railroad on his own terms. While crossing the Isthmus of Panama, he contracted yellow fever. He made it to New York, to the Metropolitan Hotel, but he was too sick to take any meetings. On November 2nd, 1863, Theodore Judah died in his wife Anna's arms. He was 37 years old. He never saw a single mile of track laid over the Sierra Nevada. The Big Four, whatever their moral flexibility, finished the job. They initially struggled to find workers. The Civil War was draining manpower, and white laborers could earn more in the Nevada silver mines. So they hired Chinese laborers, first in small numbers and then by the thousands. Eventually, 12 to 15,000 men, many recruited directly off ships arriving from Canton. These workers carved the Central Pacific's path through the Sierra Nevada in conditions that are difficult to comprehend. Hanging from wicker baskets over sheer cliff faces to drill blasting holes in granite, tunneling through mountains with hand tools and black powder, clearing snow from cuts that filled overnight. At the summit tunnel, 1,659 feet through solid granite at an elevation of 7,000 feet, crews advanced roughly a foot per day. Hundreds of workers died in avalanches, blasting accidents, and the simple brutality of the Sierra winter. The Central Pacific pushed east from Sacramento at an almost inhuman pace. On one legendary day, April 28, 1869, a crew of Chinese and Irish laborers laid 10 miles of track in a single shift. 12 days later, on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit in Utah, Leland Stanford drove a ceremonial golden spike into a laurel wood tie. Telegraph operators transmitted the sound of each hammer blow to both coasts simultaneously. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. 6 years, 4 months, and 2 days after a man stood in Sacramento mud with a silver shovel. The celebrations in Sacramento that week included a ceremony at which toasts were raised to the visionary contributions of Theodore Judah. His name, at least, was not forgotten. What the railroad did to Sacramento cannot be overstated. The completion of the transcontinental line cut the journey from the East Coast to California from 4 or 5 months by wagon, or 25 days by stagecoach, to 10 days by rail, at an unheard-of speed of 25 miles per hour. Goods, people, and capital poured west, and Sacramento became a railroad town in the deepest sense. Not just a stop on the line, but the place where the machines were built and maintained. The Central Pacific established its repair shops in Sacramento in the 1860s, starting with 15 workers and a blacksmith shop. By 1869, when the Golden Spike was driven, machine shops and car shops were already operating. As Central Pacific evolved into the Southern Pacific Railroad in the following decades, the Sacramento shops expanded into the largest industrial complex west of the Mississippi River. By 1900, 1/3 of all workers in Sacramento were employed by Southern Pacific: machinists, carpenters, boilermakers, painters, draftsmen, electricians, upholsterers. At its peak, the complex encompassed 900 buildings. During World War II, 7,000 workers ran 3 shifts. In 1886, workers at the Sacramento shops built the first ice-cooled refrigerated freight car, an invention that made it possible to ship fresh California produce, oranges, lettuce, strawberries, across the entire country. That single innovation transformed California agriculture from a local industry into a national one. It was conceived and built in Sacramento. The Big Four, meanwhile, had become the Big Four. From their combined initial investment of roughly $100,000, the price of a modest house in San Francisco today, they built a combined fortune of approximately $200 million. It was one of the greatest returns on investment in the history of American capitalism, and it was built substantially on public money. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 had offered government bonds of $16,000 per mile of track on flat land and up to $48,000 per mile in the mountains, plus vast grants of federal land on either side of the tracks. The associates, critics alleged, had classified as many miles as possible as mountain terrain. They purchased the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1868, creating what amounted to a transportation monopoly across the entire American West. Stanford became a United States Senator. Huntington became one of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington. Hopkins remained the careful treasurer until his death in 1878. He is buried in the Sacramento City Cemetery, the same graveyard established in 1850 to hold the cholera dead. Crocker went into banking, founding what eventually became Crocker National Bank, absorbed by Wells Fargo in 1986. And here is the quiet irony that sits at the center of Sacramento's story. The thing you'd notice if you were watching the money. The Big Four moved their headquarters to San Francisco. The railroad that Sacramento conceived, financed, and built, the railroad born above a hardware store on K Street, left town. The wealth it generated flowed to San Francisco. Sacramento became increasingly what it had been designated in 1854, a government town, the capital, the place where the legislature met. The rail yard workers went to their shifts, and the lobbyists walked to the Capitol, and the city settled into a rhythm that was solid and functional, and compared to the first 2 decades of its existence, extraordinarily calm. Sacramento's population tells the story in its own way. In 1860, the city had about 13,800 people. By 1870, after the railroad, it was 16,200. By 1900, it had grown to 29,000. It was never a boom town again after the gold rush. It was a steady, working city, growing at the pace of government hiring and railroad employment. The booms belonged to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, to the cities that the railroad connected Sacramento to. Sacramento was the hinge, the junction, the place the trains came from. The Sacramento Bee, founded in 1857, covered state politics and local affairs with a doggedness that eventually won it a Pulitzer. The state fair came every year. The Crocker Art Museum, endowed by E.B. Crocker, brother of Big Four member Charles, and housed in an Italianate mansion he'd built at 3rd and O Streets, opened in 1885, making it the oldest art museum in the western United States. The Alhambra Theater, a grand movie palace at Alhambra Boulevard and K Street, opened in 1927 to Hollywood stars and packed audiences. It was demolished in 1973. A Safeway was built on the site. Stanford's mansion on N Street, the one he'd raised 12 feet and expanded to 19,000 square feet, outlived him. Stanford died in 1893. His wife Jane donated the house in 1900 to the Roman Catholic Diocese, which used it as a home for orphan children. Their only son, Leland Jr., had died of typhoid fever in Italy in 1884 at the age of 15. The Stanfords, with no heir to educate, endowed a university instead, a school in Palo Alto named for the boy. Stanford University, built with railroad money earned in Sacramento. The Southern Pacific shops ran continuously for well over a century. Fathers and sons passed through the same gates, machinists who started as apprentices and retired, having spent their entire working lives within the same complex, building and repairing the machines that moved a state's worth of freight. Then, in 1996, Union Pacific acquired Southern Pacific. Freight service at the Sacramento yards dwindled. By 1999, rail operations had ceased entirely. The complex that had once employed a third of the city's workforce, from 15 workers in 1863 to 7,000 during the war and back down again, a long, slow exhale, fell silent. 900 buildings at the peak. 8 historic structures remain today. The 244-acre site, known simply as the rail yards, sat largely dormant for years, contaminated with decades of industrial solvents and heavy metals. It is now being redeveloped as a mixed-use neighborhood, housing, restaurants, a concert venue, with plans to incorporate the surviving historic buildings. The Sacramento Valley Station, the grand Southern Pacific depot that opened in 1926 and served rail passengers for decades, was restored in 2016. Amtrak trains still stop there. Sam Brannan, California's first millionaire, the man who shouted the gold rush into existence, lost everything too. His wife divorced him in 1870 and demanded half his fortune in cash, forcing him to liquidate real estate at the worst possible time. He poured what remained into a resort at Calistoga that never turned a profit. By 1887, he was selling pencils door to door. A San Francisco reporter who interviewed him that year described him as old, gray, broken in strength, able only to get about with the aid of a cane. He died in 1889 in Escondido at 70 and was buried in San Diego. No one from Sacramento attended the funeral. John Sutter's fort still stands. It was restored and is now a California State Historic Park, surrounded by a modern neighborhood of apartment buildings and medical offices. The adobe walls are still there, 12 feet high, though they've been rebuilt. Inside, docents in period costume explain what life was like in 1845. The fort is about 2 miles from the spot where, in January 1863, Leland Stanford pushed a silver shovel into mud and promised to bind the continent with iron. 2 miles and a world apart. The Hastings Building, where the Pony Express had its western terminus from April 1860 to October 1861. 18 months of riders on horseback carrying mail nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento in 10 days flat, riding through blizzards and across desert and through territory where stations had been burned by Paiute warriors before the transcontinental telegraph made the entire operation obsolete overnight. still stands in Old Sacramento. It was built in 1852, the same year the Great Conflagration burned 80% of the city around it. When the first Pony Express rider arrived in Sacramento on April 14, 1860, the city threw a party. Brass bands, fireworks, citizens parading through the streets. The Lady Adams Building, also in Old Sacramento, is the only original structure that survived that fire. It's still standing, too. The Capitol Dome is visible from most of downtown, 210 feet of neoclassical ambition topped with that gold ball, surrounded by 40 acres of parkland, the oldest state capitol park in the country. The building was nearly demolished in the 1970s when the state considered replacing it with something modern. Instead, a $20 million restoration returned the interior to its Victorian-era appearance. The California Senate still uses the original ornate walnut desks, crafted in 1869 by John Bruner, Sacramento's leading furniture maker. They were installed the same year the Golden Spike was driven. The desks have outlasted the railroad. And beneath the streets of Old Sacramento, the tunnels are still there. The old storefronts, the old sidewalks, the old doorways that open into earth. You can walk through them. You can stand in a room that was, 160 years ago, at street level, where people bought hardware, drank whiskey, argued about land prices, and look up at the ceiling and know that above you, right now, tourists are walking on wooden planks, eating ice cream, taking photographs of buildings that look quaint and old-fashioned, not realizing that what they're seeing is the second version, that the city they're standing in is an act of engineering as deliberate and as defiant as any bridge or dam or skyscraper, that the ground beneath their feet is not ground at all. It was placed there, one wagon load at a time, by people who had already survived flood and fire and plague and gunfights in the streets, and who decided, in defiance of geography, hydrology, common sense, and the considered opinion of everyone who didn't live there, that their city was going to stay. The screwjacks are gone. The laborers who cranked them are gone. The horses that pulled the dirt wagons are gone. The hardware store where 4 shopkeepers agreed to fund a crazy engineer's impossible railroad is now a museum exhibit. But the ground is still there. The artificial ground, the ground they made. Every street in Old Sacramento is a monument to the most unreasonable bet in the history of American cities. That a town on a floodplain, at the edge of a continent, with no particular reason to exist except that a Swiss bankrupt once landed there, and a carpenter found a flake of gold in a stream bed, could become permanent. That it could become a capital. That it could launch a railroad. That it could raise itself, by hand, above the level of its own destruction. The rivers still run through Sacramento. The American, the Sacramento. They're controlled now. Folsom Dam, built in the 1950s, holds back the American River. A system of levees and weirs protects the city from the Sacramento. But the rivers are still there, and the rains still come. And every winter, someone in Sacramento looks at the forecast and thinks about 1862. They think about it standing on ground that people built.